In February 1954, Marilyn Monroe was supposed to be on her honeymoon. She'd recently married Joe DiMaggio, and the couple had traveled to Japan beneath a storm of reporters, photographers, and public attention. Then Marilyn heard about the American troops stationed in Korea. The fighting had officially stopped months earlier, but thousands of service members were still living among frozen roads, military camps, and a country deeply damaged by war. Marilyn made a decision. She temporarily left Joe in Japan and flew to Korea to perform. What followed wasn't a comfortable celebrity visit. She traveled more than 200 miles in 4 days. She moved between bases by aircraft, helicopter, jeep, and military vehicle. She sang on exposed stages in rain, snow, mud, and below freezing weather. At one stop, thousands of soldiers had waited for hours. Then Marilyn appeared in a sleeveless purple dress. The crowd erupted. By the time the tour ended, more than 100,000 service members had seen her perform. Marilyn had gone to Korea, believing she was bringing the soldiers a reminder of home. But when she returned to Japan, she couldn't stop talking about the cheering. And one later reported exchange with Joe DiMaggio revealed that the applause had reached her in a way Hollywood fame never had. Before we follow Marilyn from her honeymoon in Japan to the frozen military bases of Korea, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we look beyond the famous dresses, photographs, and headlines to find the carefully documented moments that reveal who Marilyn really was. And this trip matters because she went to Korea believing she was bringing the soldiers a reminder of home, but returned carrying a memory that stayed with her for years. To understand why, we have to begin with the honeymoon she chose to leave behind. Only a few weeks earlier, Marilyn Monroe had married Joe DiMaggio. They arrived in Japan on February 2, 1954, expecting what passed for a honeymoon when two of the most famous people in America traveled together. At Tokyo International Airport, roughly 2,500 people waited in freezing wind. Photographers pushed forward so aggressively that Marilyn, Joe, and their companions briefly returned to the aircraft before slipping away through another exit. He and former baseball player Lefty O'Doul were helping the Japan Central League prepare for the coming season. Marilyn had arrived as the celebrated new bride, but almost immediately, reporters began asking whether she might visit American troops stationed in Korea. At a Tokyo press conference, she said the plan hadn't been settled. Then she added that, if she could find a piano player, she might sing for servicemen in military hospitals. It was still only a possibility, but the idea had clearly reached her. Korea was no longer in open war. The armistice had been signed on July 27, 1953, suspending hostilities and establishing the demilitarized zone. But it wasn't a peace treaty, and large numbers of American and United Nations personnel remained in a country still carrying the physical and emotional damage of 3 years of fighting. Marilyn agreed to go. She would leave Joe in Japan, cross into South Korea, and join a fast-moving military entertainment program. It wasn't the comfortable side trip a studio might have designed for publicity. The schedule would move her across military bases in freezing weather. She would travel by aircraft, helicopter, jeep, and military vehicle. She would sing outdoors, sometimes more than once in a day, before crowds far larger than anyone around her had expected. Joe remained in Japan. Marilyn flew toward Korea. She believed she was going to bring the troops a few songs and a reminder of home. She couldn't know that the sound waiting for her there would change the way she understood her own fame. Marilyn arrived in South Korea on February 16, 1954. Archival footage shows her standing near the aircraft door and waving as military personnel gather below. Men run towards the landing area. Cameras rise into the air. Officers and military police guide her through crowds that seem to grow with every step she takes. She had seen excited crowds before. Hollywood premieres had taught her how to turn, where to look, and how long to hold the smile while flashbulbs fired. But Korea was different. Many of these men knew Marilyn only through cinema screens, magazines, newspaper photographs, and pin-up images carried through months of military service. Now the woman from those pictures was stepping off an aircraft in front of them. There was no safe distance created by a theater screen. She was standing on the same cold ground. The footage follows Marilyn as she's escorted towards waiting vehicles. Servicemen crowd the roads and airfields, leaning forward for a clearer look. Some hold small personal cameras. Others simply raise their hands as she passes. She waves from jeeps. She boards helicopters. She stops to pose beside the men transporting her between bases. And almost everywhere she goes, soldiers begin running before her vehicle has fully stopped. The contrast was already becoming clear. Hollywood had taught Marilyn to expect attention that was organized around selling something. A film, a photograph, a magazine, or the Marilyn Monroe image itself. The soldiers weren't waiting because a studio had ordered them to be enthusiastic. They'd chosen to stand in the cold. They'd brought their own cameras. They'd left their daily routines just for the chance to see her pass. But the welcome at the airfield was only the beginning. Marilyn still had to walk onto the stage, and the clothing prepared for that moment belonged to a world thousands of miles away from the frozen military landscape surrounding her. The dress was designed to be seen. In surviving color photographs, it appears deep purple, fitted close to Marilyn's body, and covered with sparkling decoration. Its neckline left her shoulders exposed. It was paired with high heels rather than winter boots. It belonged beneath warm theater lights, not on an outdoor platform in Korea during February. Around Marilyn, nearly everyone else was dressed for the weather. Soldiers wore thick military coats, gloves, lined caps, and heavy boots. Some wrapped themselves in blankets while waiting. At the final Taegu performance, Stars and Stripes reported that men had claimed the best places 7 hours early and remained huddled against temperatures of roughly 30 degrees Fahrenheit. At another appearance, the temperature was reported as 1 degree below zero. Yet when Marilyn came out to sing, she appeared in a summer evening dress. It's tempting to turn that choice into a grand act of physical bravery. But the simpler explanation is more honest. The dress was part of the performance. The servicemen hadn't been promised an actress hidden beneath a heavy military coat. They had been promised Marilyn Monroe. She understood that the visual image mattered. The blonde hair, the heels, the sequins, the familiar silhouette that had traveled to Korea long before she did through photographs and films. That image was part of what she had come to give them. At first, the dress represented Hollywood glamour, carried into an unlikely setting. It was the costume that allowed Marilyn to step out looking exactly as the men remembered her. But the moment she stood in the open air, the dress took on another meaning. It exposed how little protection stood between the glamorous image and the winter surrounding the woman inside it. The cold reached her bare arms. The wind moved across the stage, and in front of her was a crowd whose excitement had already begun pressing against the limits organizers had built to contain it. At the 45th Infantry Division, approximately 6,000 soldiers had waited for several hours in temperatures reported as 1 degree below zero. Rope and steel barriers separated them from the stage. Military police stood nearby, trying to hold the lines as the program continued. But the crowd hadn't come for every act. They were waiting for Marilyn. When her appearance was delayed, the pressure broke. Soldiers pushed through the barriers and surged towards the stage. The organizers abandoned one of the scheduled numbers and brought Marilyn out earlier than planned before the situation became even harder to control. One serviceman was taken away by ambulance after the sudden movement of the crowd. The scene shouldn't be remembered as thousands of violent men attacking a stage. Most had waited in severe cold for hours. Many wanted a photograph or a closer view. The surge showed that the people managing the event had underestimated how intense the reaction to Marilyn would be. But it was still dangerous. For Marilyn, the evening dress no longer represented glamour alone. It represented exposure. She was standing in bitter weather before a crowd powerful enough to push through military barriers. And despite her growing film career, this wasn't a situation she had been trained to handle. A movie set could stop. A director could call for another take. A camera could move closer or farther away. This audience couldn't be edited. Marilyn had to stand before it and perform in real time. The men had already seen her image. Now she had to discover whether she could hold their attention without a screen separating them. She approached the microphone. The noise began to settle, and the actress known for being photographed was about to learn what it felt like to be heard. Marilyn's part of each program was short. PBS reporting on the tour describes her segment as roughly 15 minutes within a longer military show. Songs associated with her Korea performances included Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, Bye Bye Baby, and Somebody Loves Me. At the final Taegu appearance, contemporary reporting also recorded her performing Anything Goes. This wasn't a polished Broadway production. The stages were often rough outdoor platforms. Microphone cables crossed the boards. Military musicians accompanied her. Wind, rain, or freezing air could move through the performance without warning. Marilyn wasn't presented as the strongest vocalist in America. She didn't need to be. The soldiers wanted the songs they connected with her films. They wanted the familiar smile, the movement, the humor, and the voice they had heard through cinema speakers. Most of all, they wanted proof that she had truly come. Marilyn moved across the stage, smiled towards the rows of uniforms, and acknowledged the men taking photographs from every direction. The response was immediate. There was no director deciding whether the applause sounded strong enough. No studio executive waiting for box office figures. No editor choosing which reaction would appear in the final cut. Every cheer reached her at the moment it was given. That directness mattered. The public Marilyn delivered everything the troops expected. The dress, the blonde hair, the songs, and the familiar warmth of her screen presence. But the woman beneath the image was receiving something she rarely received in Hollywood. A reaction no one else could control for her. When the men shouted, she heard it. When they laughed, she knew which moment had reached them. When thousands rose or pushed closer, there was no doubt that the response belonged to what was happening between them. The performance ended. The cameras kept clicking. Then Marilyn returned to an aircraft or vehicle and moved towards another base, where another crowd had already begun waiting. The famous photographs can make the Korea visit look like one enormous performance. It wasn't. Marilyn spent 4 days moving across South Korea in a rapid series of appearances for American and United Nations personnel. Sources differ on whether the final count was 8 or 10 shows, but they agree on the speed and scale of the tour. She traveled more than 200 miles through a landscape still marked by war. Helicopters carried performers and equipment between military areas. Jeeps moved through roads lined with servicemen who had waited for a passing glimpse. Aircraft delivered her to airfields where crowds began forming almost immediately. At one stop, she toured units in an open jeep. At another, she ate in an enlisted men's mess, carrying a steel tray and joining the serving line. Then she returned to the schedule. Another flight, another base, another outdoor platform, another crowd. The archive reveals work hidden by the glamour of the most famous photographs. Marilyn had to arrive, greet officers, pose for cameras, change clothing, perform, return to transport, and begin again somewhere else. The cold followed her, so did the cameras, and so did the crowds. By the time she left Korea, she had performed for more than 100,000 service members across the complete tour. That number didn't belong to one audience on one frozen field. It was the total created by one military base after another. At the final performance near Taegu, more than 9,000 servicemen attended. Some had waited 7 hours for the chance to be near the front. Marilyn finished the show, returned to the stage for photographers, and then departed for Japan, where Joe DiMaggio was waiting. The legend kept one stage, one dress, and one roaring crowd. The real tour was more demanding. It was movement, cold, noise, flights, military roads, brief meals, repeated performances, and thousands upon thousands of men appearing wherever Marilyn's route was announced. During those journeys, photographers also captured a different Marilyn, not the woman in the sequined evening dress. Marilyn in a military jacket, standing in a jeep and smiling into the winter air. At first, it appears to be only one more photograph among the countless images taken during the trip. Its meaning would become clear much later. The servicemen didn't all share one experience. Some had served during the fighting. Others had arrived after the armistice. Some were stationed far from combat areas, while others lived among landscapes still scarred by the war. The script can't invent what each man had endured, but the surviving record shows what they did when Marilyn came. They waited for hours. They stood in freezing temperatures. They carried cameras. They crowded roads, airfields, and stage areas. They cheered loudly enough for military reporters to describe the performances as overwhelming events. They weren't watching Marilyn through a theater screen. She was standing close enough for them to see the cold touch her skin. That changed the purple dress again. At first, it had been a glamorous costume. Then it became physical exposure. Now, before the soldiers, it became a piece of the civilian world carried into a military landscape. The dress recalled movie theaters, music, dates, city streets, and ordinary life beyond the camps. Marilyn couldn't remove the winter. She couldn't repair Korea's damaged towns or shorten anyone's service. But for 15 minutes, she could interrupt the routine. She could make the men laugh. She could let them point their own cameras towards something that didn't belong to military duty. And as they received the image of Marilyn Monroe, Marilyn received something of her own. Hollywood had already proved that people wanted to look at her. Korea showed her what it felt like when the response came directly. Without a director, studio head, editor, or publicity office standing between her and the audience. She had been famous before Korea, but fame and feeling loved by a crowd weren't necessarily the same thing. And when she returned to Japan, still carrying the memory of those voices, she tried to explain the difference to a man who already understood the sound of a stadium. Marilyn had been famous long before she reached Korea. Her face had already appeared on magazine covers. Crowds waited outside theaters to see her films. Photographers shouted her name at premieres. Studio executives measured her value through ticket sales, publicity photographs, and the attention she could bring to almost any room. But those forms of fame always reached her through someone else. A director decided which performance the audience saw. An editor selected the photograph. A studio chose how her image would be advertised. Even applause at a premiere could feel like part of a carefully managed Hollywood event. Korea removed those layers. When Marilyn walked onto those military stages, nothing stood between her and the response. The soldiers didn't wait for a film review to tell them how to react. They didn't need a studio campaign to build excitement. They'd already stood outside for hours, some of them in freezing weather, because she had come to see them. Their cheering reached her without being edited. That may explain why she later called the tour the best thing that ever happened to me. It's a striking statement. By 1954, Marilyn had already achieved things that once would have seemed impossible for Norma Jean Mortensen. She'd escaped an unstable childhood. She'd become a model. She'd earned a Hollywood contract. She'd risen from small roles to major films. She'd become one of the most recognizable women in the world. Yet she pointed toward 4 freezing days in Korea as something uniquely important. The soldiers weren't judging whether she was a serious actress. They weren't discussing her contract. They weren't asking about her marriage or measuring her against another blonde actress. For a few minutes, they were simply glad she was there. That response gave Marilyn something different from ordinary celebrity. It gave her proof that her presence could lift people. Not the perfect lighting, not a close-up selected by a director. Her actual presence. She could look down from the stage and see individual faces looking back. She could hear where the laughter began. She could watch men who had been shivering moments earlier raise their cameras and smile. Hollywood had made Marilyn famous. Korea allowed her to feel the fame arriving directly. But when she returned to Japan, still thrilled by the sound of those crowds, the man waiting for her understood applause in a very different way. Joe DiMaggio knew what it meant to hear a stadium roar. Long before he married Marilyn, he'd been one of the most admired athletes in America. Crowds had watched him play center field for the New York Yankees. They'd followed his record-setting hitting streak. They'd cheered through World Series victories and called his name from packed stands. For Joe, the sound of thousands responding at once wasn't new. For Marilyn, it was. According to an anecdote published by Gay Talese in 1966, Marilyn returned from Korea and told him, "You never heard such cheering." Joe reportedly replied, "Yes, I have. It's only a few words." And because the exchange was reported years later, it shouldn't be treated as a perfect transcript recorded in the room. But the story lasted because it captured something recognizable about both of them. Joe had spent years receiving the controlled respect given to a great athlete. When he stepped onto a baseball field, he knew why the crowd had come. Marilyn's relationship with attention was less secure. People stared at her everywhere she went, but staring wasn't always the same as appreciation. Photographers could make her feel powerful one moment and exposed the next. Studios could celebrate her popularity, while refusing to give her the roles or pay she believed she'd earned. Men could desire Marilyn Monroe without showing much interest in the woman carrying the name. The cheering in Korea didn't feel like that. The soldiers weren't waiting to question her choices. They weren't negotiating her contract. They weren't asking her to prove that she was more intelligent than the characters she played. They were grateful she had crossed thousands of miles to stand in front of them. Joe's answer may have been factually true. He had heard crowds that large. But Marilyn wasn't really trying to compare numbers. She was trying to explain how the cheering had reached her. For Joe, stadium noise was connected to achievement. He hit the ball, caught it, won the game, and the crowd responded. For Marilyn, public love could feel uncertain. The applause might belong to a character, a photograph, or the fantasy Hollywood had created around her. In Korea, the distinction disappeared for a moment. She walked onto the stage. The men saw her, and the sound came back immediately. That was the feeling she was trying to describe. We don't need to turn this brief exchange into the reason their marriage later failed. Their relationship was far more complicated than one conversation. But the story does reveal how differently they experienced fame. Joe understood the sound. Marilyn was trying to explain what the sound meant. And she kept another reminder of that meaning, long after the cheering had faded. Marilyn Monroe left behind thousands of professional photographs. Some were carefully lit in studios. Some were designed to promote films. Others became famous because they captured the blonde hair, the white dress, or the expression the public expected from her. But among her personal belongings was a much simpler picture from Korea. It showed Marilyn standing in a military jeep, wearing a bomber jacket and smiling in the winter air. There were no sequins, no fitted evening dress, no warm studio lights shaping her face. She wasn't posing as the polished Hollywood figure the soldiers had watched on stage. She looked like someone caught inside a real moment. According to a Vanity Fair account examining Marilyn's personal possessions, she carried this snapshot from handbag to handbag. On the back, in her own handwriting, she wrote, "I like this one the best." Why that photograph? We can't claim to know exactly what Marilyn saw when she looked at it. A personal object can suggest meaning, but it can't give us direct access to someone's thoughts. Still, the contrast is hard to miss. Hollywood kept the images in which Marilyn looked most carefully arranged. Marilyn kept an image from a difficult 4-day tour, taken after she'd traveled through cold weather, military roads, airfields, and noisy camps. In the photograph, she wasn't protected by the character of Marilyn Monroe. She was simply standing in a jeep, surrounded by people who were pleased she had come. The purple dress had carried the public Marilyn onto the stage. The bomber jacket belonged to the woman moving between performances. One image gave the soldiers what they'd hoped to see. The other appears to have given Marilyn a memory she didn't want to lose. She could have chosen almost any photograph of herself. She chose the one from Korea. And she didn't leave it inside a studio archive or an album stored on a shelf. She carried it. The Korea tour didn't create Marilyn Monroe. She was already a major star when she arrived. It didn't permanently free her from insecurity. It didn't repair every difficulty in her marriage. And it didn't change the way Hollywood treated her overnight. When she returned to the United States, the contracts, cameras, studio pressures, and public expectations were still waiting. But the tour gave her an experience Hollywood hadn't provided: a live audience, an immediate response, and the knowledge that her presence could give people a brief sense of connection to home. The soldiers received familiar songs, laughter, glamour, and a break from military routine. Marilyn received something too. She learned that she could stand before a crowd without a film camera protecting her. She could handle the noise. She could hold the stage, and she could create a bond with an audience in real time. That mattered for a performer who hadn't built her fame through live concerts. On a film set, a scene could be repeated. In Korea, the moment either worked or it didn't. The crowd's reaction told her that it had worked. The tour also became one of the most remembered celebrity appearances in the history of American military entertainment. The USO still identifies Marilyn's 1954 Korea performances as an iconic part of its history and records that she entertained more than 100,000 troops during the tour. But the value of the story isn't only its size. 100,000 is an unforgettable number. What mattered to Marilyn may have been something smaller. Looking down and seeing one soldier smile, seeing another raise a camera, hearing a laugh that arrived because of something she had just done. Hollywood gave Marilyn evidence that her image could sell. Korea gave her evidence that her presence could matter. Now return to the purple dress. It wasn't sensible clothing for a Korean winter. It couldn't protect Marilyn from the wind. It couldn't warm her bare shoulders or keep her heels from pressing against rough wooden boards. It couldn't repair the damaged country surrounding the military camps. But practical clothing wasn't the purpose. The men had seen Marilyn in photographs and films. For many of them, that image belonged to a distant civilian world. Movie theaters, evenings out, music, city lights, and ordinary life back home. When she stepped onto the stage wearing that dress, the image they recognized had crossed the distance and become real. At first, the dress represented Hollywood glamour. Then, against the winter landscape, it showed Marilyn's physical exposure. By the end of the tour, it had become something else. A piece of home carried onto a military stage. Marilyn stood there cold, tired, and far from the controlled conditions of a studio. Yet surviving accounts and her later comments suggest that the soldiers' response made the discomfort feel secondary. The dress didn't create that response. It simply brought the Marilyn they knew before them. The woman inside it had to do the rest. She sang, she joked, she moved across the stage. She looked directly into a sea of uniforms and allowed the men to feel that she had come for them. The sequins reflected the light. But what the soldiers remembered was that she had actually arrived, and what Marilyn remembered was the warmth that came back. The tour ended. Marilyn returned to Japan. The military stages were taken down, the crowds returned to their units, and the purple dress traveled back toward the world where it belonged. But one image remained. Marilyn standing in a jeep, a bomber jacket around her, winter air against her face, soldiers close by, and a smile that didn't need a studio backdrop. That's the image she reportedly carried from one handbag to another. Not Marilyn beneath perfect lights. Not Marilyn shaped by a photographer's instructions. Marilyn alive inside a moment she had chosen to remember. Hollywood gave the world thousands of photographs of her. The photograph Marilyn kept came from Korea, after she'd left her honeymoon, crossed frozen roads, performed on exposed stages, and heard more than 100,000 service members answer her with a sound she never forgot. The soldiers had expected Marilyn Monroe. What they met was a woman willing to travel through the cold to stand before them. And perhaps that's why the picture mattered. The dress showed the legend. The photograph preserved the person. If this story helped you see Marilyn beyond the famous photographs, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell carefully researched stories about Marilyn's meetings, choices, performances, and the quiet moments that revealed the woman behind the Hollywood image. And in the comments, tell us which moment from Marilyn's life first made you see her differently. Because the world remembered the purple dress and the roar of the crowd, but Marilyn carried home a smaller memory.